So today's review will be of the Hifiman HE-4XX, a Mass exclusive planar magnetic headphone coming in at around $200 US. Now, this is actually the third time that I've owned this headphone, and I've actually wanted to review this a long time ago. However, due to one reason or the other, I wasn't able to get a unit in for review. However, I have it in my hands today, and so today we are going to talk about why I think this is probably one of the best bargains in audio right now. So starting off with the build, overall the build is about what you'd expect for the price. It is quite solid actually, surprising for a Hifiman headphone. This is using the old traditional Hifiman headband with the very solid steel hinge here, very solid steel pieces adjustment, as well as a piece of spring steel inside the headband. Now the headband is wrapped in this fake leather that does feel quite comfortable and does look quite nice. Bit of stitch on the sides that gives a little bit of character, I think. Around the sides you have these plastic height adjustment mechanisms here, and this used to be a big breaking point in old Hifiman headphones like the HE-400 or 500. However, with the Hifiman and Mass edition, this has been kind of fixed up. So moving on to cups themselves, you have really standard Hifiman fare here. It's a really nice textured plastic for the cups themselves, as well as a metal grill that is pretty standard with other Hifiman headphones like the 400S, 400i, 500, all that. And the pads themselves are Focus A pads. I believe these are probably the only Hifiman headphones that come stock with Focus A pads, and what it is basically leather on the outside, velour on the part that touches your head, and the inside, instead of having perforated leather like the Focus pads, it has just more velour. So how does this sound? Now this is a headphone that sounds, I'd say, slightly warmer than neutral. There is a little bit of a treble spike that gives it a bit of sparkle, and overall it extends reasonably well in the treble, especially given the price. Same story with the bass, it extends very well. Overall I think this is a very pleasing neutral sounding headphone that's maybe a little warmer than neutral. So the bass itself, I'd say, is not the most dynamic compared to, let's say, higher-end Hifimans, higher-end headphones. However, for its price, it's perfectly acceptable. I think it slams reasonably well for its price, extends well, and the bass gives enough texture, gives enough nuance to make it worth the price. And I think that in terms of bass, this does sound definitely better than something like the Sennheiser 600 or the 650, where on those headphones, because of the dynamic driver, you get much earlier bass roll off, as well as less textured, less physical bass. Moving on to the mid-range, I think that for this headphone, mid-range is another really strong point. The mids on this are quite even, I'd say, and quite in line with where I'd like it to be. Sounds quite neutral. Maybe for some people it might be slightly recessed, but I think that it's at a good spot. The mid-range on this headphone comes through pretty well. Male vocals, female vocals, instruments, they're all quite balanced sounding, not overly thin, not overly thick either, and just treads that fine line very well. And overall, just very pleasing, great detail. Compared to competition, I think that compared to something like the Sennheiser HD650 or the 600s, those will have more push forward mids, and for those headphones, that the mids are also more detailed. However, I think that the mids on this are perfectly acceptable for the price. Compared to something like the Beyerdynamic DT990 or the 880, I think that the mids on the Hifiman are a little better because they are more in line with where I want them to be. They're not as scooped out as in the 990, or they're a little bit more present in comparison to 880 as well. So moving on to the treble. The treble of this headphone, I'd say, is probably the weakest area of the three. However, it's not by much. It extends fairly well, but it doesn't give crazy air like compared to something like the Sandara or the Ananda. However, it does extend fairly well. You get enough of the high frequencies to discern a lot of information. This headphone, however, does have a little bit of a treble peak. I can't pinpoint or tell you what area in the frequency response that spike lies. However, I'm sure you can all go and find some measurements on this headphone to back that up. But there is a little bit of a treble peak, and that treble peak does come through when you're coming from something like the, let's say, Hifiman Ananda, which has a much more even but even better extended treble. So there is a little bit of a treble spike that's causing a little bit of occasional harshness. However, that aside, the treble is pretty detailed as well. I think that's another really solid area of the performance of this headphone, because it is hard to find headphones, especially in lower price brackets, which do treble well. And I think this is a headphone that does treble quite well. It is pleasing without being dark. I think that's a really fine line that a lot of companies want to tread. On one hand, they want to display as much information as they want, but on the other hand, they don't want to bump up the treble too high or make it too harsh or have too many treble spikes, so that will make it unlistenable. One of the big culprits of this is the Beyerdynamic DT990. That's a really detailed headphone, but the treble tuning just makes it so difficult to listen to long term. The DT880 is much less offensive in that regard. However, it is still a little peaky in the treble. For the 650, Sennheiser HD650 is a case of where they went a little overboard. I think the treble's a little too dark on those. I think the 600 treble is really spot on as well. So moving on to other areas of performance, for timbre, I think this headphone has okay timbre. I wouldn't call it class leading. I think that given that it's competing against the HD600 and the 650, which are pretty much timbre benchmarks, even in high price brackets, this has a really tough time competing with timbre compared to those cans. However, it still does sound pretty natural, especially compared to something like a DT990 or 880, where those sound a little metallic-y, a little thin. These sound much more natural. So a timbre, I think, is good for the price. It's just that its competition is HD600 and 650, which are pretty well-known benchmarks for that aspect. Moving on to Soundstage. I think this is one of the areas where it pulls ahead of the HD600 and 650. The Soundstage on this headphone is wider than those two. It also images just as well, I think, and probably even a little better. The HD650 and 600, it sort of has a 3-blob feeling. Now this sort of has a little bit of that too. However, I think that it doesn't have as big of a hole in imaging in between those 3 blobs as the Sennheisers do. So overall, I think the imaging on this is pretty decent for its price. Now, it's not going to image as well or be as wide as a DT990 or a DT880. However, it still is quite perfectly acceptable for its price. So in terms of dynamics, I've probably gone over a little bit of this when I talked about the bass. This is not the most dynamic headphone for its price. I think that something like the DT990 slams a little harder. However, it is not the least dynamic in its class either. It beats a lot of headphones in price range, including the HD600 and 650 for that slam factor. So overall, I think that you won't be disappointed by the dynamics of this headphone. Overall, I think that this is a really good offer for its price, because it walks a really fine line between all the different aspects, the tuning, the detail, the soundstage, imaging, timbre, slam. It kind of treads a fine line where it balances all those without kind of compromising any of them. So for example, something like the HD600 650, yes, you are getting pretty much really incredible timbre, really good detail, and really natural sound. However, you kind of have no soundstage almost. However, if you listen to something like the DT990 or the 880, where it's very wide, really good imaging, you have issues in those headphones of treble peaks and just sounding a little metallic, a little harsh. And Hifiman HE-4XX kind of treads in the middle ground between all those headphones and having just really balanced sound, really good detail. I wouldn't call it class leading, but above average performance for pretty much all the aspects of the headphone. So because of that reason, I think this is one of the best all-rounder headphones to have for its price, and it would be a really good addition to anyone's collection, especially to complement something more specialized like the 600 and 650 for vocals and mid-range, or if you're complementing something a little wider, a little more exciting and trebly like the DT990, this will be definitely a great addition to kind of give you a different flavor for listening. So overall, I think that this is a great headphone for its price, and while it doesn't stack up to more expensive Hifimans like the Ananda or the Sandara, it's still offers great performance for its price, especially given the fact that this headphone seems to be going on sale on Mass Drop. I think currently it's $160, and sometimes I've seen it for as low as $130. And for that price, this is an absolute steal for a cheap planar magnetic can that's really well built, I think, and offers a really good sound. This is a no-brainer.